Welcome to Bold Thinking, entrepreneurial stories honestly told. In a world full of chaos, this is a podcast about the people making positive change in the world, using bold thinking to transform business and themselves. Today, I'm speaking live in the studio to Simon Large, who most recently was customer director at Cathay Pacific in Hong Kong, before returning to the UK and setting up his new customer experience consultancy. He joined Swire, Cathay Pacific's parent company, in 1991, so it is totally fair to say there isn't much he doesn't know about the ever-changing world of airlines, which, as we know at the moment, has been a massively interesting topic in the world. So welcome to Bold Thinking, Simon, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. I was thinking about a world full of chaos. It does feel a bit like that, but it's lovely that we're back in the studio talking to one another face to face. That's a good sign. But so much is happening at the moment. It's a fascinating time to be thinking about brands.
Well, yeah, we were talking about, we set up the podcast last March, and I think, myself and the team, we were in the middle of sort of lockdown, and it just felt really pessimistic, the world, what was going to happen, and shops closing, industries failing. The airline industry was obviously massively affected, and we just thought, okay, the world needs a lot of bold thinking. It needs optimism. Where are the shining lights in the world? What's happening that's great? So it's brilliant that you've come in today, Simon, to tell us about your career, your approach to customer experience at Cathay Pacific, and also just tell us a bit about the industry and what's gone on over the last, couple of years, because it must have been absolutely bonkers for you guys.
Yeah, there's a lot in all of that. But I started, as you said, in the early 90s in the airline industry. I went straight from university out to Asia with the Swire Group, as you say, and their biggest company is Cathay Pacific, or their biggest brand is Cathay Pacific, and they gave me a job on the front line for 2 years at Kai Tak Airport, which at the time was, I think, regarded as the most exciting airport in the world for many reasons. And so I had 2 years taking care of customers on the front line. And back then, the airline was sort of 50 airplanes, 2 million people a year, very limited technology, really. So it was very much about face-to-face, about managing VIPs, ordinary customers every day. And so that's where I got my kind of grounding, if you like. And that's where I learned about the interesting world of handling consumers. And in airlines, probably 40% of people who travel are quite anxious generally. That just is the nature of the business. So you see the full gamut of kind of emotions when you're working on the front line in aviation, particularly sort of anger, despair, worry, excitement, all of those things. That's kind of why when you're flying, actually, if you've ever watched a movie when you're flying, you kind of cry a lot or you laugh a lot. It's that heightened sense. So yeah, you do have to learn about customers, the hard way in a sense. So that's where I started, and then I finished, as you say, just a few months ago, having done 5 years as customer director of the same airline, and then it was a very different business. So that was 35, 40 million passengers a year, 200 airplanes, much greater technology. The business had gone from being just about fairly straightforward transport to being about entertainment, hospitality, whole retail. These were all new parts to the business, and enormous amounts of technology, digitization, sustainability was a big. So levels of complexity had changed massively. I suppose the one thing that hadn't changed enormously was the fact that you still had to put the consumer at the heart. Of course, you had to understand people, and that was almost the hardest thing, I think, in aviation in a sense, and keeping a brand alive and keeping it relevant was understanding how consumer trends were changing and how behaviors were changing. So yeah, those early experiences at the front line were invaluable for me, and I'll always remember them. The first week I was in the airline, just thinking back, I was asked to handle quite a famous tennis player who'd arrived into Hong Kong to play an exhibition match, and he had a well-known temper, and he hadn't brought the right visa with him. And I was asked to, and he couldn't get in. And so I was asked to go down and to calm him down. And I literally went down, I remember, and this guy had thrown all his rackets on the floor and was treating the immigration officials treating the immigration officials as though they were the sort of umpire in a tennis match. And I had to sort of take him aside and say, look, this isn't going to work here. You're going to have to come down. Otherwise, you are going to have to get on the plane back. But anyway, I mean, it was just a really interesting time. It's been a fascinating business to be a part of.
I mean, that's a massive growth, 50 to 200 planes, just an indicative number there. And obviously, when the pandemic hit, everyone wants to know about this. I'm absolutely sure that must have been very, very difficult for that industry. I mean, talk about pivoting. It's hard to pivot where and, what happened?
Yeah. So most airlines parked probably 90%, 80 to 90% of their airplanes in the desert. Certainly by now, I'd say most airlines. Some airlines have got a big domestic network in the States, for example, and that continues to go well. Some airlines have big cargo networks, and that's been a huge business that has carried on, irrespective. So it's not as though everything came to a grinding halt. But on the passenger side, it's been a massive change for them. But I guess there'll be some good that will come out of it. Airlines have had to think about diversifying their brands, getting into other areas to generate revenue. They've had to think much more about hygiene, which can only be a good thing probably going forward. They've had to think much more about the digital experience. They'll have to think much more about the sustainability of the business going forward too. I think there'll probably be fewer business travelers on the other side of this. I think everyone's learned that more can be done through Zoom, clearly. Now, at the same time, I would argue you can't quite beat a face-to-face meeting yet. I think Zoom doesn't replicate it exactly, but there's no doubt that there are many people who used to travel, real road warriors, who will now think, actually, what was I doing? I can spend so much more time at home and just do far fewer trips in the future. So it is going to revolutionize the business. I think the thing is to try to pick the bones out of it and try and get the best out of it that they can on the other side. And there'll be some good things, like I said, that will come from it.
No, I mean, it's probably the most affected industry, I'd have thought, isn't it? Overall.
I would think so, in terms of just the amount of money that's been parked. I mean, the amount of capital that's just been, and the amount of debt that's been incurred. Yeah, it's going to be very far-reaching, the impact. No one's going to buy any new airplanes now for some time to come, or not very few airlines are going to be able to afford to buy new airplanes. So new aircraft development will be a problem. That's a concern because new airplanes are going to be more environmentally friendly. New technology but they need investment, but I don't think anyone's going to be buying those. So old airplanes are going to be flying for longer, and that's going to be a problem for the industry. But yeah, it's I can't think of another industry that's been affected as much. Maybe hotels, I don't know, but it's been a challenge.
One of the things we've spoke a lot about on this podcast is this whole thing around bold thinking. And, looking back on I think there's a twofold question. What do you think bold thinking means to you? And looking back over the last, period of your career, but also what could it mean for you moving forward? Because obviously you've moved roles, you're rethinking your future, what that looks like for you. So I think for someone like you, the question is, looking back, what's your boldest thing? But moving forward, what does bold look like to you? How brave are you? Are you going to be in the same sector, industry, go back? What's your plans?
Gosh, there's a lot in that. So I thought, obviously, coming on to a podcast called Bold Thinking, it's important to think what we think that means. I go back myself to a book I read in 2005, which really had an impact on me, partially because I love the title, but more because I love the content. And that was the book by Yvon Chouinard, who runs Patagonia, called Let My People Go Surfing. And I thought that was about the boldest thinking that I'd come across in terms of how to build a company, how to think about branding. And I still think today, to be honest, that is the answer to me to that question about bold thinking. I think now it's about how do you get that alignment between doing good for society, good for the environment, but also building a great consumer brand. I think if you can get that right, if you can get that intersection together, I think that is the way forward. That is how people can be bold and really address some of the challenges that society now has that we've just discussed and aren't going to go away. And I still believe that commerce is the most powerful tool by which you can do that. So governments, charities can try, but I think brands ultimately have to be at the forefront of that. I go back when I started in terms of being bold. I suppose when I was in the early part of my career, a friend and I wrote to our chairman at the time, and we were just small pawns really in the business, and we wrote a letter. I think it was a letter because it was pre-email to the chairman in Hong Kong, and said, was there a way that our business at the time could have a better impact on society? Was there things that we could be doing that? At that stage, it was more around poverty because we were working in some very poor parts of Asia, and we were quite concerned about just how our business was going to survive with so much poverty around us. And we had a number of ideas then that we put to him, and it was kind of a Jerry Maguire type moment, really, if you remember that movie where he writes something down, and it was a bit make or break. And I remember we were summoned, and I was very nervous, to this big house in Hong Kong, and to have tea and discuss. And I thought it might be the end of my career. And he told me then, I remember him saying, I appreciate the letter, but really it's business's role to just make profit and drive shareholder value. And then, if there's some left over, you give that to charity. And that's the way it works. And either get your head around that or go off and do something else. And I remember that had quite a profound impact on me then. And I thought about it a lot ever since. But I think now the great thing now is there is this real consumer desire for brands that are, as I say, doing some sort of good as well as providing a great customer experience. I mean, after that initial letter, I then subsequently was part of 2 or 3 rebranding exercises in airlines, particularly. I did some other rebranding elsewhere, but that's always quite an emotive thing. Because, when you've got 200 airplanes or, that kind of number, usually it involves painting them, which is quite high profile apart from anything else. But also, it's aviation is high profile by nature. So getting into those kind of projects were always quite bold in that sense. And you always had to really rethink, who was our consumer? What were we trying to stand for? What was the future going to look like? How do we build that into the brand positioning? And making the case to do it was always quite challenging and difficult. So I would say those were areas where some boldness was required. I think going forward, I'm really interested in how brands stay relevant now. And a number of the things I've mentioned or we've talked about already, I think are going to be part of that. So I just don't, the moment you stop thinking about your consumer, the moment you are not agile, I think is the moment you're at your weakest as a brand. And I think, and so that's the challenge for every brand out there is how do you keep that agility? And how do you challenge yourself to change? Particularly if you think things are going well, quite often you think, well, we'll just keep the same formula, that will work. But often that's your most vulnerable point, I think.
No, I mean, we've had quite a lot of conversations on the podcast about social entrepreneurialism and what that means. And obviously, back to your thing earlier, as we both know, it's about the profit going back into the organisation to help whatever charity is the most, is on their agenda or is on their target, which it makes it incredibly difficult for big funded businesses, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it does. It does. So I totally have every sympathy and empathy for that. But it doesn't, I mean, building a business model, that doesn't have to just be about charity, does it? It can be, I listened to one of your previous visits, Change Please, which was, I thought, Jamal, who was a fantastic talker and speaker about a business model that's built in. It's built into they still produce great coffee and it's a great customer experience if you go to one of their coffee shops. But at the same time, they're doing great things by looking after homeless and building sustainable lives for them as well. So I think it comes back to looking at the entire business model. And as I say, it does sometimes require significant change. And
you're right. I remember reading a story recently about, Ben and Jerry's when they set up. I think it's 7% or 7.5% from day one was always about, giving back, and a lot around sort of climate change. And they've got some of those really provocative advertisements where the world goes 1% hotter, and they put the ice creams and they just go, they just suddenly melt. So they really tied it in really good to their positioning, their brand, their mission. And it got baked in. And even I think when they got bought out by Unilever eventually, they sort of have tried to keep that original foundation of the brand. But I think you're right, it has to be baked in at the beginning and seen as your sort of original essence or core to why you exist or why you're created in the world, doesn't it? It's harder down the line than to suddenly go to Cathay Pacific, right, we're just going to take 7.5% profit out of that to do for climate change, isn't it?
Totally agree. So that is the biggest single challenge, I think, for legacy brands is exactly that. It doesn't feel authentic if it's sometimes not built in at the outset, or the people at the top haven't bought into the idea. But I think most brands that I've worked with recognize they've got that challenge. Now, do you stop it and start again? Do you break it all up and begin again? That's always an option. It's a brave option, but it's a possible one in some cases. I think it is possible to change course when you are a big brand and find a new identity, but it's a lot of work and you've got to be committed. But it's a good challenge. It's a necessary challenge. So it's one I'm quite excited to continue to be a part of. I mean, in my final years at Cathay, every airline now has to grapple with climate change. It's the single biggest challenge for airlines to take on. Will we all stop flying tomorrow? I don't think so. I think flying has been an incredibly positive thing for the human race, but on the whole, but that doesn't excuse that industry from trying to address the whole issue of emissions. And so, I mean, the good thing to see is that most of the major airlines now have committed to being net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050, that kind of time frame. It is going to be hard, though, like I said earlier, with the fact that you may not get the new airplanes coming out anytime soon, and they're going to be a big part of that puzzle. But biofuels, making it easier for consumers to offset. I mean, airlines have been bad at that. How do you make it really easy for me to offset my flights? That's an easy one for some airlines to do to make that experience better.
So do you think, just back to your earlier point, do you think that a lot of brands put customers at their heart?
No, I don't.
Is it more rare than common?
I think it's rarer than common from what I have seen. And I think putting customers at your heart is a little bit simplistic. Do I see brands or experience brands that I think really have very strong customer insights at their heart that are kind of the bellwether that's leading them every day, challenging that business? No, I don't see that very often. When you see really strong insights teams at the heart of a company who are kind of almost reporting into the CEO, that's when there's an indicator that I think they're thinking correctly. And by insights, I mean, these are obviously teams that do spend hours and hours interviewing customers, but also they look at future trends, they look at technology, they have to bring it all together. It's not just about, listening to consumers, is it? I mean, the famous line from Henry Ford about, if I'd only listened to consumers, I would have built a faster horse. I don't know whether he actually ever said that, by the way, but it is still a useful cliche in a sense. So I do think, you do have to look at the future, and you do have to bring that into your thinking, as well as putting, listening to your customer base. I remember when I started in the airline industry, we used to be very pleased with ourselves at Cathay because we had comfortable seats, we had good service, we had good food, we had positive surveys, these paper-based surveys, these awful surveys everyone used to have to fill in on an airplane. Always used to get very positive surveys, and used to go into these meetings and people say, yeah, no, it's all looking pretty good. And Emirates came into the business and put, in-flight entertainment systems on the back of every seat. And of course, overnight, everyone said, oh, we didn't know that was possible. Oh, we'll have some of that. That's what we now think is the most important thing, or one of the most important things. And everyone else had to catch up. So there was an example where we just hadn't thought about the future and what technology was going to do. And we were just too comfortable in our own position. So, I think you have to be constantly trying to imagine what the world's going to be like and what's going to change your business.
Yeah, and sort of think beyond. I remember the first times I flew many years ago. Shows my age now. People used to smoke at the back of the plane.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. It's like, how does that work?
Yeah, and if you were unlucky enough to have the seat in front, and it was called no smoking,
Yeah.
Whatever. I mean, that was just extraordinary. You're basically inhaling everyone's smoke for the entire flight. It was a terrible experience, wasn't it? Yeah, awful.
No, and I agree with you. I think it's almost like thinking beyond customers' expectations and thinking, what does that look like? So back to the thing about bold thinking, you're at the moment, you're setting up a new customer experience consultancy. What brands would you like to work with? Who's out there that's on your, we're allowed to talk about your hit list, who would you love to sort of, or even like,
Well, I find all of them so interesting, particularly in the UK at the moment, because that's where I'm now located. But I walk down a high street and I can't help myself but look at every window of retail brands and try and think how they're going to survive. The high street names. I look at banks and I think what are they going to do on the other side of this? Not just because everyone was anyway going, well, not everyone, many people were moving more towards a digital interface with their bank, but there are many who still want to go in and see somebody, and how are you going to make that easier, maintain some of the hygiene. I think about what will come on the other side of this. What do we think will stay and what do we think will quickly go? So, I was thinking today, well, the face mask may disappear quite fast, although we won't be so alarmed when we see someone down the street walking with a face mask in the future, but I don't think it will be a permanent legacy, at least immediately, of this pandemic. Having said that, I think hand sanitizer might be. Mm. So, things like that are fascinating. I genuinely, it's almost become second nature for me. If I've put my hand on the banister going down the tube, to think, well, I must wash my hands. And that seems quite a sensible evolution, if you like, to me. So, yeah, I would, I think every, retailers, banks, airlines. My background is bricks and mortar as well as digital, so I like both. I like to think about both, and I do like the human experience still, and I still like to hope that we will have they'll have a big part to play. The shops in the high street, and I'd hate to see our high streets empty and everyone's sitting behind a laptop doing everything there. That doesn't seem right to me. So, but how could we reimagine the high street of the future? I also enjoy thinking about the work experience too. So, offices of the future, what will they be like? And I think that's a great development. I think flexible working is a really good thing that might come out of this for the younger generation. That's not something we had when we started. We did that 9 to 5, to use, I think, the Dolly Parton song, or slog, didn't we? And it was always and it was, to get in. But now that may not be so much part of people's future. And I think that's a good outcome.
No, I think it's massively important. And I think this whole, I'm sort of like, obviously I'm a big, I shop online, I shop in store, but I'm just finding at the moment that it's so saturated, obviously the online thing. Where do brands have a voice? It's really, really, really difficult to brands to actually have a voice. So I suppose I'm a little bit old-fashioned in the sense I walked up Soho today, looked at all the shops. Dragon's Den, a guy on Dragon's Den had actually got himself a little shop there. And Sophie's Art, this amazing artist who I've been following, she's got an amazing space there. And I really do feel like there's this need or this want for people to connect again and to really have that sort of physical, face-to-face and experiential and, coming together in the community. I suppose my biggest worry is there going to be funding behind that? Are people really going to invest in that? Are they going to invest in that bricks and mortar experience, or what do we think is going to happen with all that in the world?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to whether the investment will be there. I do think your point, though, about people want a little bit of kind of joy back after a fairly bleak period. And I do think that's an opportunity. I also think something we were talking about previously, I think there's an opportunity for compassion and kindness. That's something that struck me a lot in the lockdown, and in that, I think a lot of people suffered a great deal, whether it's mentally or physically. And there are, I say, the real opportunities there for brands, I think, to provide those things and really resonate with everyone on the other side. As you say, on the other side, maybe we're not on the other side, but certainly, as a learning from this. And I hope that will be the case, and that we really celebrate, all the great things that we were unable to experience for that 18 months or so that we were in lockdown. I do see opportunity.
So you're back in the UK now. I actually had a really lovely weekend away with a friend who works over in Asia, and we were talking about the different cultures around, there's obviously a massive thing at the moment over in, Asia around personalization and monitoring. It felt a bit like Minority Report and the score systems. And what is the difference, would you say, or have you been feeling back in the UK, in that sort of like Asian cultural thing? It felt, he was talking to me about this amazing tracking, really feels incredibly tailored towards people, feels incredibly personalized in different areas. And I was like, is this a good or a bad thing?
Yeah, and certainly in Hong Kong, where I was based for a lot, there was real paranoia in a sense about that, actually, about being tracked and how much personal information people had access to. But you're right. It's an interesting trend. It's one that I don't think we can prevent, but it's certainly one we have to keep an eye on and really understand consumer sensitivities on it. I've always found the UK, I haven't been here for a long period of time, but it's always very entrepreneurial here. I think we have not lost that. In my senses, we haven't lost that, which is, you can feel it here. There's always ideas. It's always leading edge in that sense. We can be a little bit negative at times, I think. It feels that way. It's a bit doom and gloom sometimes, but there's no question that, again, where I was previously in Hong Kong, they're still not out of lockdown. So they haven't started traveling. They haven't, and they're not about to for another 8 to 10 months yet. Here, it's almost in times feels like, we're on the other side, as I say, of the whole thing. So it's a very different environment. Now, time will tell whose strategy is best, but I think, it feels here as though there's a real vibrancy in terms of young people too, in terms of what they think is possible. That's certainly my sense of it, and I find that liberating and exciting. So that hasn't gone away in a way that perhaps I didn't feel to the same degree in Asia. So, but there are there are pros and cons on both sides.
I was reading the other day this fact that 9% of students, there's 126,000 in the UK went to uni. Out of those, 9% have actually got their own business, already started up.
Yeah, I think Gen Z are amazing.
I was just pretty astounded by that.
Yeah, I think they continually astound me, actually. It gives me real hope.
So just on that then, so how optimistic are you at the moment? And I suppose I'm going to split this into two now based on that. So how optimistic are you at the moment in the UK? And then I'm going to say in Asia as well, because I'm really fascinated by that sort of difference.
I am optimistic in the UK. The optimism comes from youth and watching them and also, as I say, seeing some of the better things that have come from this and understanding that, how, as I say, commerce or business can address some of these challenges. I think that whether it's healthcare, whether it's schooling, whether it's flexible working, there are real opportunities now to do things differently, whether it's, how we address, food or sustainability issues. I just can see businesses and brands here particularly beginning to come to terms with this in a very serious way that I didn't see to the same degree in Asia. I didn't see that level of innovation and often, as I say, some of the most interesting ideas do come from here. They do come also from the most. But that being said, on the technology side in Asia, wow, there's some extraordinary things coming out of China every day. I have to acknowledge, and whether they are as concerned with some of the challenges that I've just spoken about, I didn't sense. But I do hope when they do set their sights on, I say, something like climate change in China, they certainly have the capability and the funding to really do some powerful things. So, yeah, it's just a question of time, really. But I didn't see it to the same degree there that I've seen it here.
Yeah, we just had a podcast earlier with the Design Council, and at their heart now is design around the planet and for good, and to really take under the wing their sustainability. So it does feel, even in our community, it's become massively important. So just on that, what do you think it's going to take? And I know we touched on it a little bit earlier, but what do you really think it's going to take for a brand to thrive in the future? And I suppose I'm going to talk about it from a local and global perspective, if I'm honest, because I sometimes think there's a little bit of coming from a very much a global brand background. How do you see a brand thrive in the future on a local and global level?
Well, we talked about, the business model at the outset, and the goals, the values at the top of the brand, and I think that's where it starts. What its mission is. And as I said, I think if you can in some way align doing some good along with creating a good customer experience, I think if you have a mission in some way aligned to that, I think that's a very important start. I think beyond that, we used to talk about two things I always used to think a lot about, and I still think they're valid in a customer experience in a brand, and call them plumbing and poetry. You've got to know, obviously, who your consumers are. These are issues of plumbing. You've got to know what they want, what they need. You have to have a really strong, insights capability, so that you're constantly on top of changing behaviors, trends, and so on, and you're challenging yourself. And you've got to fundamentally have a strong experience. So in airlines, that was about, if you didn't pretty much depart on time, if you didn't have a clean airplane, if things didn't work, everything had to work on the airplane. You had to get someone there with their bag more often than not, if you could. If you did those things right time and time again, that was the core, and that was the plumbing. But then beyond that, you had to add a little bit of poetry. You had to have some touches where, you just brought some joy into a customer's life in some way, shape, or form. It didn't have to be huge and big. It just had to be enough to say, you cared, and I think if you can find those moments as a brand, particularly now, I think people respond so well to them. Not just done through a screen, but done in, as I said, often face to face. If you could recognize somebody and say welcome back, or say really have a enjoyable journey, whatever it might be, that made a tremendous difference. So. Yeah, I think, as I say, it would be around having the right mission. It would be around having a clear understanding of the plumbing of your business and delivering on it time and time again. And then it would be adding just a little bit of poetry to that as well, in ways that would just bring a bit of joy to people's lives.
I really love that sort of poetry and plumbing. I think it's that sort of ideational joy and recognition of that is brilliant. I really love that. Well, thank you, Simon, for joining us today and for listening to Bold Thinking, Entrepreneurial Stories Honestly Told. If this episode got you thinking, share your comments on LinkedIn, Twitter or Instagram, or contact us at hello@thehonestbrand.com. Join me next time to hear from someone who's making a positive change in the world. And I just want to say thank you to Simon for coming in. That's incredibly knowledgeable, inspiring about the airline industry, and also, what your journey is going to look like next.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure to think about this as well as to be part of it.